Okay, so this is not a happy video. Recently, I had a long-time viewer of the channel reach out to me on Hey Hero, and he wanted my thoughts on his relationship because his girlfriend was always criticizing him. He wasn't able to talk about the problems that he thought were in the relationship. She wouldn't participate. She wasn't taking any responsibility. And he wanted my thoughts on what could be done to fix the situation, how he could improve. And when I gave him my response, my honest thoughts, he was shocked that I was using words like dysfunctional, toxic, codependent, abusive. I know we're still not comfortable as a society using that term with regards to women because what the stereotype of like an abusive relationship is you've got some overly macho man who's like really sexist and really controlling and is always just criticizing his partner, even being violent to her. I mean, yes, that's absolutely abusive, but in some ways that's not quite as dangerous because that's obvious. That's really easy to spot. When women are abusive, it's often a lot more subtle and it can be more dangerous because you're not even aware that it's occurring. They're more sneaky about it. Women tend to be a little bit more attuned to the interpersonal stuff in relationships, and so they can often outwit their boyfriends without them even realizing it. In comparison to men that can often seem sort of clunky and clumsy as they stumble about trying to figure out the right way to conduct themselves, women can be incredibly well attuned to the moods of their partner and very calculating in the way that they choose to undermine him. Women can be very deceptive. And one of the absolute worst aspects of female abuse is that they can often convince the man that they're not being abused, or even worse, convince the male victim that he's actually the one being abusive. It's always confronting to me when somebody who says that they're a longtime viewer of this channel can fall victim to tactics of female abuse, because so much about what motivates me to make these videos and to talk to you guys is because I want to protect you from that. All of those toxic, low quality, abusive women that just want to take out their pain on men, I want to protect you from that. And so it feels a bit like I've failed if someone says, I'm a big fan of yours, I watch your content, and they're still falling for this kind of stuff. I'm like, all right, I need to do more. Please do not be complacent about this. Don't be arrogant and think like, I'm a man, I'm strong, like, oh yeah, she has a little tantrums or whatever, but they don't bother me. They don't affect me. I'm not worried about this. Do not underestimate this problem because you do so at your peril. If you don't give women their proper credit, their due, for how much misery they can create, then you are liable to end up in an absolutely miserable relationship. Please believe me when I tell you that the wrong woman can wreck your life. And so in this video, I'm going to explain 5 different ways that women can be abusive towards you that are a little bit more subtle, that you might not actually realize are occurring. Often these can be very hard to pick up on, like if she's just outright like criticizing and insulting you, it's like, right, obviously that's inappropriate. But often in these conversations with an abusive woman, something might just not feel right. You might not understand it. You might not be able to name it, but at a gut level, you know that there's a problem here and that the problem's not with you. That's what I want to talk about. That's what I want to explain is those situations so that you learn about them now in this video so that when you're coming face to face with it in real life with a girl, you know how to spot it, you know how to name it, and you know how to avoid it. To help me out with this, I found this image online that talks about 5 different methods of gaslighting. And that's what I want to explore. So let's look at this first one, withholding. When it comes to a woman who's being withholding, it's not so much about what she's doing as opposed to what she's not doing. When it comes to romantic relationships, one of the most common forms of withholding that you see from women towards men is an inability or an unwillingness to acknowledge the importance or the validity of the male contribution. So let's say he's the majority breadwinner in the relationship. He's actually financing their lifestyle, or he's really generous with his time. He thinks up thoughtful ways to take care of her, to plan amazing experiences for her, his own contribution to her life, giving her his time. And yet none of that seems to matter. She doesn't even seem to notice. Ordinarily, that kind of generosity from him, you would expect gratitude or praise, but she withholds that from him. Now, why does she do that? Well, the answer is actually really sad. It's because if she acknowledges the legitimacy of what he's contributing to her lifestyle, to the relationship, then she can no longer play the victim. If I actually admit to him that some of the things he's doing are benefiting me and contributing to our life, then there's going to be an additional pressure on me to reciprocate. I'm going to have to start pulling my fair share, but I don't want to do that. I like this gig that I've got where he's doing all these amazing things for me, but I pretend like I don't even notice it. I don't acknowledge it. And like I mentioned, it doesn't have to be about money. It could be anything. Like if you've spent the week planning this like surprise getaway for her or a party with all her friends, or you put in like a lot of effort with the housework that week, really going above and beyond. When a woman is being withholding, then she will not praise you. She will not acknowledge that anything's even changed. That is a type of gaslighting, and gaslighting is a form of abuse. And what happens if you try and talk about it? You say to your girlfriend, I feel like I've really been putting in a lot of effort recently. I've done so much for you. Or can we talk about our finances? I feel like, the time's come for you to be making more of an equal contribution. When a woman is withholding, she won't engage in those conversations. She won't participate. She'll say things like, I don't want to have this conversation, or I don't know what you're talking about. It's abusive. You have every right to have that conversation. Your feelings, your perspective is 100% valid. You shouldn't have to tolerate being in a relationship with a woman who won't engage with you. Withholding is awful, but so is this next one. Trivializing. Most men who've been in an abusive relationship with a woman will understand just how frustrating this one can be. You can see there, it says belittling your feelings or disregarding them. A lot of men don't make a big issue about this one because it can be very difficult to actually pick up what's wrong or what's actually even occurring, because it's not as obvious as a woman who's just being outright withholding, in that she might acknowledge the phenomenon that you bring to her. Like, yes, I completely recognize that all of that is occurring. It's just that she trivializes its importance. Where you see this over and over again is when women trivialize the importance of the man's emotions. He wants to have a conversation about them. He's like, I'm really scared about how you've been treating me recently, or I'm really angry that this awful thing just happened, or I'm really sad about what's going on. And she'll hear those emotions and acknowledge that you're feeling that way, but she'll kind of just dismiss it like, okay, like it doesn't seem that important. I guarantee if she was having an emotion, it would be, stop everything. This is really important. We have to deal with it. It just plays into that sexist belief that women's emotions are more important than men's emotions, more valid. It's bullshit. It's sexist. We live in this culture where there's all this talk about, why don't men open up about their emotions more? Why can't I find a man who's in touch with his emotions? Why can't I find a good, sensitive man who can talk to me about this stuff? But women lack so much self-awareness on this one, because they might say that they want an emotionally aware, in-touch guy, but guess what? If the emotions that he's in touch with are frustration with you, sadness about your behavior, fear about how awful you've been treating him, then she doesn't want to hear about those emotions. If he sits down and says, I'm really angry at you for how you've been treating me recently, she's not going to be like, yes, fantastic, finally a guy who's communicating with me emotionally. Suddenly it's going to revert back to those same tactics women always use to shame men, like, God, don't you get so angry. Don't try and frighten me. You're out of control. And so many men fall for it. They're like, yeah, okay, I guess I just got to toughen up and be a man, whatever that means. Usually means don't have any emotions that are inconvenient. Of course, it doesn't need to be a conversation just about emotions. It could be any number of concerns that he brings up. Like, I'm worried about, the financial pressures that our lifestyle is putting on our relationship. I think we need to shrink back. Think you need to contribute more. Or I'm not satisfied with our sex life. Or I'm unhappy with how you've been treating me. She might hear these concerns, she might nod, but just casually, she sort of trivializes them like, okay. She doesn't take it seriously. She doesn't give the same weight of importance to your concerns, your issues, as she does to her own. That is trivializing. I see this trivializing far too often when I'm trying to speak to women about the difficulties that men face in relationships and in the dating market. You tend to find some women can acknowledge that there's an issue, but they kind of think that it's trivial, like it's not very important because, the only victims here are really men. It's actually the subject of my latest Patreon video. Should you, as a man who's hoping to generate attraction in a woman, ever speak to her about the difficulties you face in the dating market or that men face in general? It's a very interesting video. If you want to see that, go and check out my Patreon. But let's move on to the next form of gaslighting. Denial. This one, I'm going to make the case that this is probably the worst of all of them because it is a particularly dark form of psychological abuse that is actually designed to make you question your own sanity. It looks like this, like if a man says, I think we need to talk about your behavior last night, or what you said to me last week, or that incident last month, whatever it might be, her response is, I never said that. That never happened. As sort of like clumsy and simplistic as that might seem, like almost childlike, and it's just, I just deny. Don't underestimate this one. It can be very, very effective because it's so outrageous and so bold that it actually does stop a lot of men from pursuing it further. They're like, what? Like, I was sure she just said that thing. Like, you couldn't just deny that, but she seems so sure of herself. She just says that never happened. I never said that. Am I crazy? Did that occur? When this happens over and over again in a relationship, that's when you start to find men keeping notes, trying to save documents, keep things in writing, even audio recording their girlfriend because they're so worried that when they try and talk about it at a later date, their girlfriend's just going to flat out deny that never happened. The reason why I say that this one is particularly dark is because it shows a level of malice and disregard for their male partner to such a degree that it's extraordinary anybody could hold the value system of their own comfort higher than another person's sanity. Because that's what's going on. She doesn't want to be responsible for her behavior. She doesn't want to be accountable for the things that she's done. And so she just denies them. But in so doing, she makes you question your perception of reality. I'm worried that I'm not getting across just how serious this is. So let me just put it as black and white as I can. For a woman who invokes the denial form of gaslighting, she would rather you believe that you are insane than her be accountable for her behavior. It's dark. It's really, really dark. Now, maybe you're smart enough to have some incontrovertible proof, okay? Like there are things over text message, or you've got witnesses and you call them up and you confront her with factual evidence. Well, that's when she moves on to the next tactic, diverting. And this one sucks. This one is so frustrating to deal with. It's when you're trying to have a conversation with your partner. You're trying to talk about one subject, and yet she just seems to keep shifting the conversation in all these unexpected, random ways. And so you can never actually nail down what she thinks about anything. You never actually find yourself at some kind of conclusion. So let's just take an example. Like maybe she screams at you like, you're so lazy, you take me for granted, you never do any of the housework. And so you pull out your journal where you've actually made notes of all of your contributions over this last month, all the times you did the laundry, all the times you did the cooking, the cleaning up, whatever it might be. And then you show her that evidence. For a woman who is using the diversion form of gaslighting, her response to that evidence is, what? You just want me to feel bad about myself? Oh, what? So now you're saying that I'm lazy. You're judging me? Are you happy to make me this upset? Does this please you to see me all worked up like this? Or who cares if you're doing all that? What about the fact that you don't spend any time with me anymore? I mean, I don't know, maybe like the spending more time with her, that could be a legitimate discussion, but it's completely inappropriate right now because you're talking about something else. She brought it up, and you responding to her means that the next logical progression in that conversation is her responding to your response. That's how dialogue works. That's how a relationship actually functions when two people are talking to each other. But if she just diverts and pushes the conversation in a different direction, how are you possibly meant to make any progress? This is a classic abusive tactic, and unfortunately it's very common. And my concern is that for men who've been conditioned to think that this is normal, they're not going to spot it. I mean, maybe they grew up in a household where maybe their mother would do this, or their sister, or something like that, and they just feel like, oh, that's how women are, it's difficult to have a conversation with them. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I'm being too logical. No, fuck that. Diversion is abuse. Expect better. Demand better. You deserve better. When you are talking about one subject, then you are entitled to expect that she's going to respond to that subject. Her changing the subject halfway through because she doesn't like the implications of where this conversation's going is completely inappropriate. If I could say one thing in defense of women do this, it's that it's often not conscious. Okay, so this, I mean, it's completely inappropriate. I'm not backing down from that, but a lot of women are not even really aware that this is what's going on, because in truth, there is a little bit of a gender difference about how women are processing the world, in that their emotions are a lot more at the forefront. And so if she feels as though she's being taken for granted, she feels as though she's a victim, she's kind of being consistent to that, even if she jackknifes from one subject to the other, so long as that common theme of her emotional experience stays at the forefront. And so it can be frustrating as a man. It's like, we were just talking about the dishes. Now you're talking about how I don't spend enough time with you. From her perspective, he's being unreasonable. He's not just flowing with a conversation. Don't you see that it was never about this? It's about the fact that I feel this way. Even when confronted with evidence, she's not likely to actually reconsider the legitimacy of her emotions or her claim to victimhood. No, she's just going to find a different set of circumstances, a different set of evidence in order to justify that emotion. But I want to reiterate, as much as like an enhanced understanding of male-female differences might make more sense, it's still completely unacceptable. Do not play that game. My advice is that if you're with a woman who's constantly diverting you, when you notice that she's doing it, just stop. Don't engage. She might get upset, she might get hysterical, but you can stay calm. Just say, we were talking about this. I'd like to finish that conversation before we move on to something else. Now let's move on to the final form of gaslighting. Stereotyping. This one is becoming more and more common every single day. What's particularly sad is that I find that nice guys, like genuine nice guys, are the most vulnerable to this form of gaslighting because they have actually internalized and adopted that cultural guilt that says masculinity is bad, men are bad. So what would be some examples of this? Okay, well, let's say a boyfriend talks to his girlfriend about money issues and says, look, if we're going to continue to live this way, I'm going to need you to contribute your half of the rent. And instead of actually addressing the legitimacy of that perspective, she might say something like, you're such a typical man. You think that all that's important is money. Or perhaps he brings up some dissatisfaction he has with their sex life. Instead of actually addressing his emotions or legitimacy of his concerns, she might just shame him like, oh, typical man, you just think with your dick. There's more to this relationship than sex, you know. You're such a pervert. What she's trying to do is use those negative male stereotypes to trigger a feeling of guilt inside you, make you feel ashamed of yourself so that you stop standing up for yourself. This can go to such crazy extremes. There are even men out there who think that it's their job to sacrifice their best interests inside their romantic relationship as part of their male effort to address the historical injustices that have been done to women. Yes, I cook and clean 80% of the time and she only does it 20% of the time, but you know, for a long time, women couldn't vote. I'm so glad that you are still watching this video and that you've discovered my channel at all, because hopefully one of the things that I am trying so badly to do in these videos is actually seeping into your consciousness and making its way into your value system, getting rid of all of the cultural indoctrination, which is that your masculinity is nothing to be ashamed of. You being a man does not make your perspective, your values, your emotions any less valid. And anybody who suggests otherwise is a fucking sexist. So become familiar with these awful, toxic stereotypes that are applied to men. Look at them inside yourself, discover your own emotions, and release any shame or guilt that you have about your own manhood. That way, you are going to be way less vulnerable to attacks that come in that disguise. Now, I hope that it goes without saying that these gaslighting tactics are obviously not just exclusive to women. Men are more than capable of employing these same tactics as well. And so if you're listening to this as a man and you're thinking, I've not just been on the receiving end of this, I've done this to women, cut it out. It takes a lot of courage and self-awareness to admit when you've been abusive, but you don't have to be defined by your past. You can fix things and make a better future. Stop taking out all of your emotional pain on your girlfriend. Take it to where it belongs. A therapist. Work through your issues. Work through your trauma so that you can have healthier relationship dynamics. Heal yourself and stop the cycle of abuse. Because here's again, one of the most uncomfortable truths is that abusive relationships that flow entirely in one way, like just the man abusing the woman, just the woman abusing the man, is what we most often see in the media, but that doesn't actually paint an accurate picture of the landscape. Abuse in cyber relationships is often reciprocal, and so if you're sick of your girlfriend treating you terribly and abusing you, gaslighting you, then make sure that you're not doing it as well. The moral high ground is worth something, and as the man in the relationship, the responsibility may be on you to actually demonstrate that there's an alternative way to communicate with each other. Remember, if you like this video, you like what I have to say, you want to see more from me, then come over to my Patreon. I've got hundreds of videos of exclusive content. The quality is really high. We have a great community. I'd love to see you over there.